So here's my conspiracy. Part of the reason why China allowed the virus to kind of spread and to halt the United States is because the Phase 1 trade deal had just been signed a year prior, and they really cannot fulfill the obligations on it. But one thing that could stop all these economic activities is if the world ground to a halt and we didn't have any production left. So that's my conspiracy. I'm like, Xi Jinping was like, wow, perfect, we got a pandemic. Let's use this to wage a war on the world and to not have to deal with Trump stuff. Because, you know, I've spoken to former Trump officials about the situation. Like, they don't want to talk about it because obviously, you know, the Phase 1 trade deal really didn't go anywhere. But I was just like, what would happen if it actually had gone through, right? Now, the impact would have been great, but we never saw it because, you know, obviously the pandemic came. Let's go!
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to I Came With Fire podcast. We're back here with David Zhang. We've had him on a few times, but if you're a new listener, I'll let David introduce himself, and you can go back and watch some of our previous episodes. But what's up, David, man? Thanks for coming back to the studio.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm David Zhang, and I host China Insider on YouTube. And you guys can check out my channel, and as well as follow me. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, and everywhere else.
Hell yeah, man. Yeah, dude. So glad to have you back. Always really, really good information. Honestly, when we have you on, we get a ton of feedback. Man, that was great information. Wow, I really enjoyed listening to David. I'm sure it probably generates a lot of interest in your channel and stuff like that. And I always enjoy listening to you. But anyway, I see you got the tofu drag hat on. I fucking love that, dude. You got the merch going, man.
Yeah. No, it's a bestseller, actually. I think the whole thing about Chinese infrastructure, it's such a joke that this is like a natural sell, natural buy for people. So I really enjoy talking about that aspect.
Yeah. Dude, I've liked that you've sort of started doing some humor in what you do now too, not just like the straightforward news thing. I like that. It's pretty funny.
Yeah. Who's the other the guy that I follow, Matt Kim? Are you aware of him? I think he does like Free Thinkers on Instagram. If anybody follows him, his channel's like kind of big, but it's really funny because when I first started following you, David, you were like just very straightforward, like to the point. And then I looked over at his stuff, and he does this like, I am going to speak very slowly and try to be very, and it's like Matt, if you ever see this, like, I like the information you put out. It's good stuff. But your delivery, man, it's like I have to watch it on 1.5 speed. But I wanted to bounce off of what Brandon was saying and say, yeah, man, you started adding the humor. And I was like, dude, this is getting good, man. It's like getting a little spicy over there. You threw some of the peppers in.
You guys want to know the reason why I did that? It's because, so I came across a point last year where I was like, there's so many different topics, and I have to make every single short for them. It just takes too much time, and a lot of topics people simply don't care about. So what I did was instead I said, you know what? If you can make this attractive for younger people, they'll start to listen to you, and then it takes them a little bit while, but you know, over time they can watch all your stuff, and they can start to kind of understand things piece by piece, rather than this 40-minute podcast of what's going on with the Chinese government, bang, right in your face. And so I think because my YouTube audience is very young, and it's very interesting. We can talk about this, but it's all of the countries that have been on the shorter end of the stick when it comes to dealing with China that are watching. So you got the Indian population, or have a lot of audience members from the Philippines, the United States, even the UK. But I think that's because of all these spy scandals that's been happening. But yeah, so very young people, very, very active on the short sort of format side of things. So, their attention span, it's not really good. I've noticed my attention span has decreased so much since doing this. So, but that's the reason I kind of switched a little bit.
No, I like it. And I'm glad that you brought up the UK and the spy thing, because it's actually one of the things I wanted to talk about tonight. So it segues sort of into, I wanted to talk about the way that the Chinese exact propaganda on the United States and sort of their methodology, and then obviously your opinion on it, but the efficacy of that propaganda on the United States as well.
Yeah, great question. I think let's start with how they do things. So you have obviously the very straightforward, in-your-face ones, right? Those are easy to detect. You can practically tell because they're literally lying, right? Using the fake information. The ones that I've been kind of worried about is people who, especially, I find this a lot now on YouTube, which is people who seemingly like they're travel bloggers or just, very non-political people that are now living in China, right? So they say, well, hey, look, all these Western media, they paint this picture of China being blah, 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 whereas me, I'm actually living in China. But they never show you things other than this. For example, they would go to a city, they would be like, this is the street, right? Look how beautiful things are. Or they'll go to like a subway
Check out
station.
the street food.
Yeah.
This is so delicious. Yeah.
Exactly. But it's like, if you really think about it, I can do that, right? Even in some of the worst areas. Like I can go to, Compton and find a place where I can try to, it's all about the angles and the shots, right? So I remember there's a video of this guy walking around and he's like, there's no homeless people in China. And then, he cuts away from this guy because the camera almost showed the homeless person. So those are harder to go by and they gain a lot of view. And I think, it also differentiates between the civilian side of things and also the academic side of things. Because if you're on Twitter a lot, you'll notice a lot of these accounts that have hundreds of thousands of followers who are actively speaking on behalf of China and what they do. And they're advocating for the so-called, alternative world order, China-led order. Those people, you could say they're academics, and you try to engage with them. They have their own little talks. They got all this, research going on and stuff like that. So it's hard to argue with those people because, even though what they're saying is not true, they've created this environment where they're saying, there's information available for them to kind of back up their claims, right? And then one more point I'll add, which I think is quite important, which is this is more apparent in Chinese-speaking programs rather than English speaking, but with English also pretty apparent is people who don't appear to be like they're pro-China or pro-CCP at all. Like these people, I would say 90% of the time, criticize China or even actively go against what the Chinese government is saying. But then it's that 10% of the time when it comes to a very critical moment and they suddenly almost flip 180 and then say, actually, these things, it's supposed to be, props to the Chinese government, blah, 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 blah. So they build a lot of trust within the community. And then, it's one of those critical moments where they go and they hit a really big point and it makes people think that, oh, actually, maybe China's not that bad. So that's one of the issues that we're really looking at trying to deal with. But, if you guys are pretty active on Instagram, you see there's a lot of pages promoting things like how beautiful China is, these tourist spots and things like that. I think, honestly, it gets to a lot of people, whether we like it or not. Some people simply don't care about the political side of things. They just care about, food, travel, looks, and things like that. So they branch out to different areas. Some people like politics, they get those. Some people that get the propaganda through these very soft ways, right? They're called soft power approaches. Some through culture and things like that. So it depends on where you're looking at, but it's all over the place. And they curate their content through, because they've learned over, basically throughout 2016 to 2020, right, from when Trump got elected to the pandemic era, they learned that their very straightforward propaganda doesn't work anymore because most of the world no longer trusts them, especially post-COVID. So they've switched. And I think that's now where things have shaped into.
I'm going to jump on that question really quick, Brandon, if you don't mind. You say they understand most of the world doesn't trust them. Do you think that the right-wing media in the United States beating the drum about COVID, coming from a Wuhan market, do you think it was because that was effective? Or do you think it's because, is there just a natural suspicion towards China from the West? Where you say that you thought it was, they don't trust them. Why? I'm interested in that.
Very interesting question. Now, actually, I would argue that the side that has turned, whether they were willing or not, was actually I would say the left-leaning side. Because for me, what I've noticed is the right-wing side has always had the suspicion that China wasn't good. the government that is, right? But the especially I think through the late Bush to Obama period, that was very much the peaceful China-U.S. relationship. So I think a lot of the established media, they weren't willing. Honestly, you notice even to this day, when you read articles from CNN, NBC, or ABC and CBS, right? They actually do a lot of coverage on China news, but it's just the language they use. They're still very much almost protective in a way that they don't want to seem to harm this media relationship with China. Same thing with like Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg. They criticize in a very weird way. They're like, oh yeah, I don't know if it's because of their so-called journalistic standards, or if they simply think that they need to maintain this idea that they seem unbiased. But what I have noticed, even with that being said, compared to pre-2020, you see that even their perspective of China has changed. So I actually see a shift much bigger on the left side, which either way it's a good thing, right? And another point I think also for me is what was traditionally seen as the threat of China, right? Today we obviously know that China seems to be the only bipartisan thing among the two parties in the United States that they can somehow agree on. I mean, they did a whole TikTok bill, signed into law, right? That's pretty impressive. So even today, I think nothing else really the two parties can really align on except for China. So for me, yeah, I see a lot of shift on the left side. I always thought the right wing, so-called right wing media, had been very much, I guess you would say, warning of the threat in certain ways. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of
no. But I find your perspective to be very interesting, because going back to a couple of things that you were saying about the YouTube channels, like the soft propaganda, I definitely know just from the amount of travel that I've done and some of the content that I consume on YouTube. It's like, hey, I'm going to go to this country. Let me look up like what's good street food, because I always like to go and check out like local street food and places to go see and stuff like that. And now that you're saying that, it's kind of like the phenomenon, like when you buy a red car, now all of a sudden you see that same red car everywhere you go. It's like, now that you're saying that, I'm looking back through the things that I've watched on YouTube, and I'm like, there is a lot, especially in like the foodie community and travel blog community, a lot
Fashion
of positive, YouTube content surrounding China. So that's very interesting. And then it reminded me of something that we talked about in the last podcast, which was an example from our side, where San Francisco is basically a hellscape on earth, but when Xi Jinping came to visit, like they cleaned that city up in an instant, and brought out all the flag wavers, and there was red everywhere when he came in. And so it's like that type of propaganda, I think, is not by any means relegated to China. I think you see it over here in the West as well, and look, you giving like really good examples of people being able to see that, so that way they recognize it, because now the curtain comes down, is very useful for people. So I do appreciate that from you.
Yeah, I think it just add a point on the dynamics here, right? So it's not that the propaganda itself is, say, Chinese food or Chinese culture. It's the fact that the government is so good at using these aspects that obviously are pretty attractive to some people, especially if you're into Eastern culture, right? That's what Japan, Korea, all of these countries have that. But it's the fact that they're saying we have to weaponize it. Now, there's a YouTuber. Her YouTube channel is called Aini. She actually talks a lot about this. It's one of my favorite YouTube channels, AINI. If you guys want to go check it out. But she talks about how China, the CCP, right, is terrible at exporting this like culture invasion, even though they. In my view, they do some parts really well, but compared to South Korea, they do their K-pop, Japan, they do their anime, right? The cultural exports of China is very bad in that sense. But what they've learned over the years is that instead of using us like Chinese faces, they can use American faces or British faces to be the front of this, right? And then use those people to say, this is my experience in China, so attractive, you got to come and join us. Now, you could argue, is it really effective considering you have all these foreign companies leaving China because of zero COVID and things like that? But it's a desperate attempt by them to try to paint the picture that China is really good. And I think that's the
digital
dynamic.
insurgency.
Yeah,
Well,
well,
I think, yeah. Please finish. I'm sorry.
No. I'm just saying, like, how widespread digital media is today. Like, it's just it's a space that they have to conquer.
Right. And I think that there's one other place. I don't know if you guys are willing to dig this deep into it, but it was very funny. My wife and I were having a conversation. You know, there's been lots of allegations into the Biden family and how closely financially tied they are with Chinese money. And then after Biden steps down from running for president again and still remains the president, now you have the Harris pick for vice president being Tim Walz. And then all of a sudden you look and it's like he's visited China. This is very interesting information to me. He's visited China over 30 times while being an active member of the United States Army National Guard. Now, as soon as I became a soldier with any type of clearance to have knowledge that other people didn't have, right? Like one of the very first things I was banned from traveling to China, right? Like I have to request being able to go there because, you know, according to my job, it's a high profile job. But this guy, you know, is a senior non-commissioned officer in the United States Army National Guard, and he's traveled to China over 30 times. And then he's taken, you know, high school students to China with him, and he's on record talking, you know, and saying all of this very pro-China, you know, almost propagandized speech. And so I found it to be very interesting that the allegations of the Biden family, and now that the Biden family is rotating out of federal politics, now right on his heels, you know, the Harris campaign chooses Tim Walz, who also seems to have very close ties to China, to come in and shore that up. So I think that is very interesting. I'm not making any accusations here on the podcast, but I just find those connections to be, you know, a little too
pattern recognition.
Yeah, it can't be extemporaneous. You know what I mean? Like I noticed that, guys. So I think that the power, like the propaganda that we talk about on one side is soft, but then you look at the other, and I think that there's very good evidence to support the idea that there's a lot of Chinese money in the United States government as well, and they're going that direction with it.
Yeah, I'm willing to bet that, you know, this is both parties have been approached by
probably
by
look at Mitch McConnell
by Chinese money over the years, and
Sure.
if we really talk about, so here's my interesting observation, which is that if we're taking the families, right, and then we say that, you know, they've been with China, they built a relationship for decades, then we can say that obviously they're, you know, probably in the bed with China. But then what I've noticed so far is that, at least I hope this maintains, you know, stays the same, which is that at least when it comes to actual law making and legislative questions, they're not being like controlled in the sense that they're like, oh no, we're going to be against it. At least that part is good, right? But then I'm always wondering, you know, if China spent all this money on these people, to infiltrate into, you know, DC through whether that's K Street or whatever else, Chinese embassy, whatever. Actually, you know, talking about this because the New York mayor today was
Yes.
you know, indicted.
We're going to be talking about that tomorrow night.
Yeah, one of his aide, Winnie Greco, was this like Chinese spy, right? So it's like it's all levels. Like, and I'm guaranteeing you, it's both parties.
Sure.
So I'm just like, I'm very shocked that like even the TikTok bill got through, because clearly there were some.
Interesting. Yeah.
I did remember there were some Democrats who were like, oh, you know, this is very much like anti-Asian hate or whatever, things like that, right? Even when they were trying to build the Select Committee on China, which is a bipartisan committee, there were still lawmakers who were saying, oh, you know, this is anti-Asian hate, this is witch hunt and things like that. So I hope that this stays this way, that they're not, their own bribe, you know, with the Chinese government or whatever is not being influenced in their decision making. So that makes me wonder how much Chinese money really went into this, and if it's effective in the end. So that goes into my question.
That is a good question. No.
That goes into my question, my observation for the other one, which is why Democrats are like the left. For me, it was such a big shift because I'm like, I feel like over the years they've been infiltrated harder, and yet if some of them are willing to do that, that's a good thing. But like you, yeah, swallow. Well, I mean, that's a.
I think I have an answer to your question, but it's just my opinion, and I think the shift that you're seeing. So coming through 2020 and all of the information that was swelling around COVID-19 and all the stuff that was happening from that really had China in the spotlight. And when China's in the spotlight, like any cornered animal, like there was a lot of tariffs. There was economic war going on between the United States and China. There was a lot of posturing that was happening, like stuff behind closed doors. Like there was a lot of geopolitics that was surrounded around that. And it was very hard for the United States to come out hard against China in a way that wouldn't have provoked the nation to do something drastic because of it. Right. And then we're all dealing with the pandemic and all this stuff is going on. But now that the, U.S. foreign policy has really rotated to kind of surrounding what's happening in Europe with Ukraine, what's happening with, with which by extension, Russia, which, you guys have seen them looking into our election, and it's like all Russian, is the only thing that they care about in election meddling. And then also what's going on between Israel and Palestine. And so since kind of the popular culture foreign policy issues have kind of rotated off of China, I feel like that gives the United States more leeway, right? At least, or if I'm a legislator or a lobbyer, to be like, okay, now I can do the things that I would have wanted to do in 2020, kind of, right? Because they're not in the spotlight now. So it's like now we can kind of like shift and move and do those things. And I think that's kind of what you're seeing, because anytime that the entire world is watching one thing, right, then it's really hard to make moves and do things that you need to do from a foreign policy standpoint without everybody running to their laptops, jumping on their podcasts, and making content about it. And so I kind of think that's what you're seeing. So, but that's my take on it.
Yeah, very interesting.
No, so this conversation sort of segues into the other part of what I was talking about, is that the propaganda is really just an arm of information warfare overall. It's not the entire aim. And it goes back to the unconventional warfare style that the Chinese take with mostly the United States, but the rest of the world. And so, I ask about propaganda, and there is a lot of it. And I think probably, too, a lot of the Western vloggers, travel vloggers, foodies, whatever, potentially maybe they're paid by some of maybe some intermediaries through the CCP and some of that. But really sort of curious more about the insidious ways this information warfare, unconventional warfare, is waged against the United States from the political realm, as far as like the way some of that trickles down into the American university system, and then the way it trickles down even further into policy governing education in general. How much of that can you speak to? How much of that do you think, how insidious, I guess, do you think it is? And then is this an actual plan the Chinese have, or is this like a byproduct of just sort of Chinese foreign policy and America's not understanding it?
Yeah, so one of the big issue here is because China is a closed system under the CCP, America is an open system. Much of the Western world is technically an open book. So you're at a disadvantage to begin with because the other side has access to all your information and you don't have to theirs. So I once spoke with a former State Department official, and one of the recommendations he had, obviously it wasn't enacted, it was that you could somehow take the propaganda they throw at us and kind of do a counter version of that, right? And basically being able to use information to liberate the population in China that doesn't have access to information. Now, so when they have a closed environment, what they can do is they can create a lot of things, right? So they can say, China's this way, China's that way. But then when they see things in America, like, in Philadelphia, there's a street with homeless people, with druggies. or there's illegal immigrants coming through the southern border, or if New York City has crimes of some sort, or looting, or in California, and any of these situations, right? So what China does is they actively try to undermine the credibility of the United States as a whole, as the ability to lead, because there is problems in the United States. So it's like this, right? If like say Trump or Biden. Okay, so you say, okay, well, Trump is he's mean to people. Okay, that's one of his flaws. Or Biden is old. That's his flaws. What China does is they'll say that, okay, look, the United States is incapable or unfit to govern because the president is this or that, right? But they ignore all of the fundamental ways in which the country is governed, through the people, right? Through different representatives of different levels, city, state, county, etc. So they don't tell you these things. Now, what they do is, so once they find a target, right, such as, say, the president is unfit to rule, to be in office, they will use things like TikTok, their state media, Twitter, things like that, their foreign channels, to amplify these messages. Now, what they don't do is they focus on the people in the United States, because they know that these people are less susceptible to those influences. But what they do is they project this type of information to countries around the United States, right? So they can do this to the people in the UK, in Europe, in Africa, in other parts of Asia, right? They make people think that the US is so bad to anybody that's outside of it. Because, if you're living in the country, right, you often criticize people. You say, like Biden is crap, right? California is a commie republic, or any of these things. You can say it, but deep down you know that this is probably the best country in the world with problems, right? You're trying to solve these things by criticizing it. But what they do is they take that same flaw and they say that, no, because they have these flaws, they cannot be fit to be the leader of the world. And so by creating this almost like, to us, it's a chance to improve. To them, it's a weakness. Somehow it delegitimizes the United States on the world stage. And so when they do that, so countries, for example, like Malaysia, Singapore, maybe France, Germany, right? People there, they're going to be like, okay, well, maybe the U.S. isn't supposed to be the world leader. Maybe China's supposed to be. Look how beautiful China is, right? So when it's such a layered and incorporated effort. And then you look at what's happening. You mentioned, Brandon, about the American universities, right? There is an active communist infiltration in, like, obviously through a different format, socialism, right? Gender, ideology, race ideology, things like that. Yep. It's the same playbook that basically, the United States went through in the 60s with different words, right? Back then it was anti-war, it was peace, not love, and things like that. Today it's a different method, not the same methodology, but different terms being used. But the gist of it is very much similar. So when you have the outside factor and then you have the inside factor, it combines, and it's like you're being attacked from within and from the outside. And that's what, so that's really, like, from this, you kind of have to shift away from talking about the CCP to talking about why communism and Marxism as a whole has been so influential in a bad way, right? Because every time there is problems in society, they come out and they say that we can solve your problems for you because the existing system doesn't work. But it's like so for anybody who's not educated on socialism and communism, they think that, okay, that's the solution, right? And unfortunately, the CCP knows that really well. They studied the ways of, they are Marxist and communist to begin with, so they understand this already. But when I mentioned that, like, we're being attacked from within and from the outside, the overall goal is to destroy the United States, right? There's no other reasons they would do this except they want to destroy the United States. Why? For a very simple reason, because the United States is probably the most important country in the world when it comes to defending freedom, defending the rights of individuals, right? That's something that cannot exist from the communist perspective.
Yeah, totally. I agree too, because there's all these red marker or red flags out there that are just communist Marxist talking points for sure. And a new one that you see out there a lot is anti-Semitism. And even Marx was very critical of Jews when he talked about them, the Jewish situation. I think was a paper he wrote, and he was espousing Judaism and capitalism, and how those go hand in hand. And I think he made a quote about how the secret god of Israel is money. And so all of these different facets of Marxism, communism that you see now, they're tropes through the university system. I mean, you're in New York, right? How much of these think tanks that these institutes pay for to exist on these universities, how much do you think that these things are actually the harbors of this sort of ideology, or do you think that it's more so just the left's elite education class romanticism of communism? Do you think it's coming from that vector, or is it coming from the vector of just educators in general?
Yeah, I think fundamentally there is I think if you look at history, during the Cold War, even the Soviet Union and China had a conflict, right? So it's like there's different types of. I would say this is where culture does play a role, but the Western invasion, like the invasion of the West through communism, it takes in such a different way than what's been done in the East, right? In pretty much all of Asia currently, or previous communist regimes, they've all just basically done the same. They come in, they murder a bunch of people, millions, hundreds of millions, Mao, Pol Pot, and things like that, and then they're done with, right? They built the foundation, and then they destroy everything that's there, and then they kind of go from the ground up. Whereas in the West, I don't know what to attribute this to. Again, I'm not a very, well-read person, so what I can only observe from being in a country that has Western ideology is that how solid your constitutional values are, how solid your patriotic education really is. And when I say patriotic education, I don't mean swear oath to the party flag and things like that, but like loving your country in a ways that you want to serve, protect, and contribute, right? But so I think in reality, the Western civilization, the last hope of it before it falls to communism, I think is this idea that you have, family values, core values, religious beliefs. So that's the last line of defense where I see it. But in the
Perfectly said.
So when you see the Eastern version of communism and the Western version of communism, when they kind of clash, sometimes they do.
I'm sorry, where would you draw that line when you say Eastern communism and Western communism? Can you kind of define that for me?
I would say the blatant use that they say that we are the communist party, right? You're actually seeing some of this in the United States. There's the Communist Party of USA, or whatever they call it.
There is, Communist Party of America. Yeah.
Is there like a defining line for you guys, like in the world, where you would draw that and be like, "Hey, these are Western communists"?
You mean like geographic?
Yeah. I apologize. Yes.
I would say Asia. For me, it's Asia.
So okay,
I'd be curious in the ideological difference, though, like you were explaining as well,
anyway,
David.
Please continue. I had to have a map in my head when you said that, because I've never heard anybody say Eastern communists and Western communists. It's the first time I've ever heard that. Yeah,
I'm sure there's different ways to describe it, or better, ways to say it. But for what I think it's literally comes down to, so because if you really think about it, right, most of Asia, before the end of World War II, had just either come out of a sort of a dynasty empire situation,
right?
Or if it had some sort of a warlord situation, like either way, all these countries, right? Whereas the Western part, like Europeans, had gone through, republics, like gone away from the monarchy, and they went through this whole colonial period. So for Asia, it was very much you suddenly had this. You had the emperor, and then suddenly you're like, okay, now we're supposed to function with a government, right? So it was such a big jump. And because I think, this is where they also capitalized on the history of colonialism, because, in China was very much colonized, by different countries. They took Hong Kong, Macau, all these areas from history, right? So the CCP comes in, and then they're like, we had 100 years of shame, humiliation. I'm here to tell you that I can solve all your problems. Right. So if you're a Chinese person in like the 1930s and Japan's invading, and you don't know what to do, there's this guy, his name is Mao, and he comes and he says, "You're a peasant. Come with us to the countryside. We're going to build up."
He's got an awesome haircut. You're like, wow, what is that?
He doesn't like sparrows.
Yeah.
Exactly. But let's say the same period in the United States, right? That was when things had been really bad during the Great Depression in the 20s, right. and then you come out of that, you're like energized, right? In a sense, and you really like it's a whole different world that. Here you had some level of prosperity going on, but whereas in China, for example, you didn't. You had like misery. So that's kind of basically how they come in and they say same thing with North Korea, right? Because Japan invaded Korea, and then Kim Il-sung was like, we got to use this communist thing to drive them away, right? Because it's all about like sabotage, United Front co-opting, secret underground stuff that we can do, right? So. After the war, obviously, that's where the real pain begins. So I think it's a special condition that you had to kind of establish, which in the West it didn't have an audience for at that particular period of time, and that's what created that situation in Asia. And even I think the Soviet Union is also like that too, because they had the SARS regime before that, and then. Lenin comes in and tells them that it's time for the workers to rise. So I think it's very much a dramatic shift that happened in the East, whereas in the West it didn't get a chance to. So very interesting. I mean, there must be, if you're religious, I'm sure there must be, if you're a Christian, some biblical sort of revelation to that, right? I don't know. I'm just guessing it can't just be some natural existence that happened.
No, I agree with you. And then one other thing, and this just comes from, what I do know about Asian history and Asian politics. I find it to be very interesting that the Chinese people that are so rooted in traditionalism, the Tao, their ancestors, and also to be so proud of, their clan, their history, was able to be taken by a centralized communistic government. I've always found that to be very interesting, because you would think that a people that are so rooted to their history, their traditions, their customs, their family, their ancestors specifically, right, how they were, I guess, coaxed or even forced into giving that up and to coming under a strong, centralized government, because China is, the second largest country by landmass in the world. I mean, that's a large kingdom, calling it a kingdom that you would be able to bring under one subjugation. So I've always found that to be very interesting, because there's the Western mindset and the Eastern mindset. It's like communal family tradition versus rugged individualism. But yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of like forming a thought for you guys to jump off of, but I've always found it to be interesting to think about.
I think the thing that I found interesting about it is like, if we could go back to like the Eastern Western version of the Marxist communism, is that communism is supposed to be the working party's, political ideology.
Right.
And if I could draw a distinction between the East and the West, the West sort of has co-opted that communism, and their version of communism is the elite educated class follows this, versus the blue collar worker who is supposed to appeal to about holding the power, the workers' rights, and all of this stuff.
Well,
so I think,
right? They tried during the '60s with the whole bourgeoisie and the proletariat, but then now they had to reform it around the race.
That's what. Well, right? Yes.
Yeah.
But these ideas exist in the West in the elite educated class is the point I'm making. They don't exist in the blue collar, and they don't exist there. Now they exist, so that difference between Eastern and Western communism, I think, is that it's in the West, it's co-opted by this educated class who doesn't really understand it.
I see what you're saying.
And they see it sort of as the anti-capitalism, and that's their whole shtick with it, and they don't necessarily live that way. They don't follow those ideals. They still tweet from the coffee shop on their iPhone, and all of this. But the difference there in the East, and maybe this ties into what you were saying too, Chris, is one of the reasons why they were so willing to sort of abandon their culture and history, is there is this, anytime you look at groups throughout history that have abandoned their identity or had their identity taken from them. There's a lot of suffering going on prior to that happening, and I think that the group idea becomes the new identity, and I think that personal identity gets sort of taken for granted mentally because you know it's there. And then as time progresses, it gets lost because the group mentality becomes exactly what the mentality is. And then there is no other room for any other individual identity. And then to what you said, that rugged individualism exists here in the United States. But I think the liberal left and the educated left seems to think that individualism, that this group think that they have about communism is somehow making them an individual, when in reality it is just groupthink, and they're sort of clouded in their judgment about it. Does that make sense?
No, it totally does. And when you see them online making their TikTok videos on their iPhones from Starbucks, drinking their $9 coffee, they all have the same haircut. They're all wearing the same clothes, right? I'm going to express my individualism and fight the man through widespread conformity, man. Look at me. I'm such a rebel. While they're all in the same place, eating at the same restaurants, listening to the same music. Like, you're not my real dad. You know,
they're the useful idiots to it. And, you know,
right.
to the question, David, about like the university system and like, is it these think tanks that like the Chinese have a foothold in on American universities like Columbia or NYU versus the romanticization that the educated professors tend to have with communism? I think that it's sort of a two-pronged attack where one side doesn't realize just how supportive they are passively of the more deliberate attack that there is on American ideology from some of these think tanks. Does that make sense?
No, like if you really think about it, what you said, Brendan, is so true. Because actually now, the Chinese, like the CCP officials, they don't believe in communism. They're living the most capitalistic lifestyle ever, right? Mm-hmm. Each of them have, you know, millions, billions of dollars. Like they're living the most lavish, luxurious lifestyle that you would only imagine. Because you know, when China in the 80s went through a period of capitalist transformation, everybody got rich. So once you taste that, like you're not going to go back to, you know, living in a straw hut and eating from a giant communal cooking station, right, or a cafeteria. So what they're doing now is that they want to maintain this facade because they know that these people in the West they've never experienced it. So they can just tell them what they think communism is. Look at China, right? Come look at China. China was bad, and then, you know, communism made it better.
We were bad, but now we're good.
Exactly. Yeah. So when you have that's why, right? I think that's one point where people in the establishment media refuse to talk about much is actually, you know what? Not even that. I think media in general, left and right, refuse to talk a lot about is why there's so many Chinese people coming across the border. That obviously there's the military potential there, but then there's also just regular people seeking a better life, because these people are not the beneficiary of communism in China. They are actually looking for that capitalistic life, so to speak. But people don't talk about it enough because it doesn't necessarily fit the agenda, right? Obviously, you know, Fox would talk about how these are potential, you know, military age men. Yeah. And the left is like, oh, you know, these are people that, you know, they're just seeking, right, refugee from, you know, persecution or whatnot. Could be true for both sides, but most of these people that are coming to the United States through the southern border, willing to trek, you know, thousands of kilometers or, you know, miles or whatnot to get there, it's because they're willing to do that. They'd rather die on the road than to remain in China. So you don't see Americans coming, you know, doing that to go to China, right? You don't see that. In fact, you see less and less Americans going to China. That already itself is a powerful example of why the communist system doesn't work, right? And yet you have people in universities who are saying, no, we gotta, you know, everybody has to be equal. Everybody has to have, you know, the same. We're not. They don't because most people that think what communism and socialism is that somehow when everybody is the same, that we don't need to have this leadership, or we don't need to have hierarchies or a system in place, because that's how people are. But
it's
do
naive,
they not realize that things like crime, right, corruption, anything that basically is not what they're thinking of this utopia happens because people are individuals. So it's like, oh, crime won't happen once we reach socialism utopia, or wealth is distributed equally. It doesn't work like that because humans are fundamentally individuals. In China, right, Mao almost achieved so-called socialism or communism at the end of the Cultural Revolution, because he killed a bunch of people, right?
Yeah.
But that didn't stop people from murdering. That didn't stop people from committing crimes. It doesn't happen because people are fundamentally individuals, and you can't stop people from doing good or bad things. And so I think the good thing is that if there was a program, or maybe they get a chance to, when they grow up, is they can go see countries like Cuba or Venezuela. Those are really good examples of where socialism could take you, and not the version that they're thinking of, which is somehow Sweden and Denmark or Finland.
Well, those are not truly socialistic countries, and I hate it when they're fundamentally so. Again, and I think it would be useful to jump in here and say this when we're talking about, because it can get confusing for most people. When we talk about governmental systems, we're talking about socialism versus democracy or republic. That is the government. When we talk about economic systems, we're talking about either Marxist or communism, or we're talking about capitalism. Right, or excuse me, I got it backwards. When we talk about government, we're talking about communism. When we talk about market, we're talking about socialism or capitalism. So let me say it all correct. Okay, right, but
you got it.
But that's very important, because people hear the words communism and socialism thrown around so much, and then they just go, "Oh, well, I know that's supposed to be bad, but I don't know why." Right. And so it's like, it's important to understand when we're talking about governments and how governments are formed, communism or democracy or republic, and then economies, socialism or capitalism, like what that looks like. And Sweden, Denmark, right, the Western European nations are not socialist economies. They are still capitalist economies with very heavy, like taxation, which allows them to have strong social programs that are stood up underneath of it, right? So they're not socialist, and I hate it. Like Barry Sanders goes out there, "Hey, we should be like Denmark and Sweden. Those are great countries," and you're like, no, they're not. First of all, you get taxed 60% of your income. Like,
calm down, Barry.
Calm down, Barry. But I think that's useful for people to understand, like what we're talking about, define the terms.
I just want to point out, though, only one system fundamentally ends up being a dictatorship, and that's definitely not capitalism. So if you study every example of whether that's Cuba, Venezuela, China, North Korea, or whatnot, what they start out is this very good idea. This propaganda slogan saying that we'll all get rich together. Everybody gets rich, right?
Yes.
But then it's like halfway along the line, they're like, oh no, we have to exert more control because the government has to oversee everything, right? And then it turns into China, where it's like everybody, 1 billion people is under surveillance and under strict use of things like digital, digital currency, more surveillance camera than the population, online tracing, all of these things. It's like, oh, so if you really needed to control people like this, did you really achieve this so-called utopia? You didn't. But it's like, it always ends this way because at some point they realize that it's not achievable, right? People aren't going to be the same. And so in order for people to be kept in the system to become their workers, but really in reality it's like they're slaves, they enact control measures. And that happens in every single, now, Chris, you're like making me carefully choose my word, every single socialist country that's trying to
good
build
distinction to draw, though,
on the communist model. So at the end of
the day, good ideas don't require force.
Yeah, you don't need, that's why books like Animal farm it's so interesting to describe China today because it's literally what's happening in China.
Right.
And yet people are like, oh, we have to do that in America too.
Well, if it's a good idea, Brandon, it doesn't come at the end of a muzzle of a gun, or at the end of a threat of censorship, or at the end of,
it's only a good idea to the gun holder.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. No, this is a good idea, says I.
Right.
Well, you're like, whoa. But it's
exactly.
a great point. Yeah.
And they got to take away your guns because they can't
That's right.
revolt. Right?
Only we can have guns. Yeah. That makes me think of the military civil fusion in China. That's this whole conversation. We're talking about funneling money and power, right? Like that's the next thing that comes in here. Could you? Well, Chris, you look at you have a question before we jump into what that animal is.
It's just a really short one, and then I want to turn it back over to you. But perfect example of capitalism, David. I don't know if you saw this story, but there was a gun buyback happening in one of these liberal states, and this dude went out and he 3D printed like a ton of like pistol lower handles on his 3D printer, and then went to the mandatory gun buyback, and sold them, and ended up making thousands of dollars on stuff that he 3D printed because he was like, look at all these pistol handles that I have.
If you've ever handled
by the government to buy them, and he was like, yeah, it cost me like 60 cents to make.
Dude, some of those some of that like nylon filament, it is, dude. That's an amazing example of capitalism. Some of that nylon filament in those 3D printers, bro. You can get shit feel really, really hard. What color is that? It's gunmetal black. Why do you need all this gunmetal black nylon printing filament? Don't ask questions you don't want answers to, bro. Get the fuck out of here, dude.
I think you made like $3,500.
That's amazing. $25 worth of filament. Yeah. And $18 of electricity. No.
Anyway, back to your thing.
No, just we're talking about the funneling of like money and power through up to the leadership echelons of the Chinese government, but like there is a control over literally everything, as you said, and I was wondering if you could just jump a little bit into it, the civil fusion that the Chinese government has with all of its industry, and sort of how I would be really interested for you to talk about it, how it can be an advantage over the United States, but also how it's a detriment to them as a whole.
Yeah, so there's two aspects to this. One is there are certain state-controlled corporations that start out basically with the intent to be weaponized, right? So you have things like the data side. So things that companies like ByteDance, right? They control a lot of data, right? So that's weaponization, and the ultimate intent of that is really not about the entertainment side of things. It's one, it can influence people. Second, it has data, right? Things like drones or telecommunications, these are built with the intent that they will be weaponized somehow. Then there's also companies that didn't start out with the intent to be weaponized, such as, for example, you have, it could be like a remote, not remote, like a cubicle home builder, or like certain products that doesn't seem like it has a military application to begin with, right? So very everyday products. But then it could be that this product is so widely used by, say, the United States, that the government start to notice the practicality. So this can come in any way, shape, and form, right? So what the Chinese government has been doing in recent years, much quietly now compared to before, was they would hire things called through this program called the 1,000 Talents program. So they hire all these scientists, researchers to come work in China, bring their technology, et cetera, right, to China, and then they can take that technology. What you're talking about when it comes to the civil-military fusion is you have certain companies like shipbuilding, transportation, metalwork,
communications.
what else would be it? Communications, like
energy.
They can
Energy, big one.
Energy, yeah. They can actually be used, because most of the time they will make these civilian products, but then during wartime, for example, during the Russian-Ukraine war, they're like starting sending all these material and parts to Russia. And it's like, oh, okay, so I guess you're capable of doing that. But this is not just unique to China, right? The United States has many weapons contractors who, like Honeywell, they make electronics too, right? So it's not a unique thing to China. But where it does make things very difficult and very scary is that every single company in China can be turned into this, whether they like it or not, because they control the market. So why is this an advantage? Well, basically, if you're talking about things like there's a company that did like COVID tests and pregnancy tests.
I'm really glad that you're using
BGI? I think it's BGI Genomics.
Okay.
Yeah, these are civilian uses, right? Pregnancy tests, COVID tests. And then they turn around and they can now control and weaponize the data on pregnant women, on Americans' biological data, things like that, right? So they now have those stuff. 23andMe, all these things, right? And then that's a very big advantage because at any given time, they can say that we need what you have and then we can take it from you. It's a disadvantage.
Well, a great on-the-ground example that people should remember is that we buy a large amount of our antibiotics and masks and surgical gloves and just simple medical products. We have huge contracts with China that we buy that stuff for billions of dollars a year. And in 2020, China went, nope, and it turned off the faucet and it said, just no, we're not selling it to you right now. And that's a great example that a lot of people have. I don't want them to forget that that's what happened. Ivermectin, a large amount of our ivermectin was made over there.
A lot of basic pharmaceutical products are made in China. Even to this day, a lot of it's still made in China. Or that the raw material for it comes from China.
Right. But you're getting into the disadvantages. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, but that's a very important point because the disadvantage is this happened with the semiconductor, right? So obviously, it's a big industry. It's weaponizing semiconductor for China, at least. It's a big industry. Everybody was doing semiconductor. Like literally, this meat packing plant started doing semiconductors. Why? Because there's money to be made from it. These people obviously know they're not going to make a cutting edge 3 nanometer, chip that comes out of their factory that's processing pork the day before, right? But they can make money from it. So actually, a lot of times, all these companies that prop up in China suddenly go away after a while because they simply are just in it for the short-term amount of money. So it doesn't reward innovation and it doesn't reward genius like researchers, right? Because that's also another issue with China is they don't have a lot of innovation capabilities because there's a government that oversees everything and the government is like, okay, no, we're not letting you do this because you need to do that. Because innovation comes when you're actually passionate about something. That's why the United States has been so ahead of the rest of the world when it comes to technology and service of technology, net exporting of that, right? Whereas China, it has been about producing these mass amount of low-skill goods. So if your company cannot serve the purpose of the CCP, there's no reason for it to exist in China. And then so that's really one of the big disadvantages. Another one is you risk of getting sanctioned because guess what? Your company is supplying, weapons parts to Russia, for example, right? The United States can see that this company is no longer a simple civilian company and then that they can sanction it. So all the effort you put into this one company for it to do really well, same thing happened with Huawei, right? Huawei got really hit hard during the Trump administration and their international sales just declined. The 5G stuff too, like it was terrible. TikTok too, right? TikTok too also got like very
Shut
much
up, Alexa. I do what I want.
Exactly. I'm an adult. It very much got possibly I think it's going to get divested or banned, coming this January. So they put a lot of these efforts into the weaponization part. But then because now they're so big and so well known, the United States can just be like, okay, well, we just cut you off, and then that destroys your entire progress you've built up over the last decade or so. So there's that disadvantage too. And then the last point I'll add is there's no reason for China to stop doing this because they have the flexibility to do it, right? So if something doesn't work, they just throw it away and the next company can come and do that. So it seems like everything is very replaceable, which is, in my view, a bad thing because, well, except for the fact that like the companies like Boeing, which is a lot of problems with that, right? So I don't see them getting like contracts with the Pentagon again. But companies like Lockheed Martin, there's so many, Raytheon, and all of these people, like it's a good thing to trust a brand for a very long time. Whereas in China, today you have this shipbuilding company, another day you have another one. It's like, oh, are they really of good quality? And speaking of that, I don't know if you guys saw the news today, but a Chinese nuclear submarine apparently sank off of the coast of a shipyard. And so makes me wonder if, it's because there's so much
It's a nuclear submarine, right?
It's a nuclear submarine. There's so much like corruption and things like that inside these Chinese companies. They're not really putting all their time into developing quality. They're just
this was
in it for the money.
This was touted as their most advanced type of submarine, wasn't it? Something to mimic the U.S. class of nuclear subs.
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. Did it sink this week, or was it something that the sinking happened a while ago, and it's sort of the cover up sort of came out today, right?
Yeah, so I believe this happened in May or June, according to the sources, and it makes me wonder what could have happened. Because I mean, if it's just docked in the yard, like on the, like it's in the water, but it's probably something to do with a mechanical failure or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, clearly not a good look for China. And you have all of these institutes behind it, corporations behind it, and it doesn't perform when you finally make it. That's a big problem.
That brings me to one of the. Oh.
Okay. No, I was just saying you think it's tied into what you're saying before about how there's no real continuity in any of the tech and the industry that happens in China, because it all gets swept up and then pushed out so quickly, the turnover rate.
Yeah, exactly. There's really no longevity and sustainability when it comes to, everybody's just in it for the short-term gain.
Interesting. Good, Chris.
I have a very short question for you, but something that you said earlier made me realize I didn't understand this. What amount of China's exports economy does the United States represent? Like how much of their economy are we buying of the stuff that they sell? Is it in like large, medium, small, like to them?
In terms of like, it depends on what you're looking at. If you're talking about stuff you can get from Walmart that's made in China,
like consumable goods,
consumable stuff. It used to be huge. It's a little bit less now because obviously after the trade war and things like that and COVID, people started buying more domestic.
Okay.
But the core issue is that China doesn't just make the consumer stuff for the United States, right?
Right.
It's like worldwide, and a lot of stuff that we think are not made in China is still made in China. So we talked about the pharmaceutical stuff. We talked about the medical supplies, not toilet paper. A lot of these like tools that you use to clean the household, like a brush made in China. Anything like very small. Like sometimes you might not even notice that it's made in China.
Right.
And they've done a lot of stuff where they try to upmarket the or packaging to make it look like it's a Western brand. One of them, actually, I have a product from this company. It's called Anchor. They make like chargers and battery banks and stuff like that.
Yep.
Their quality is actually pretty good, but they're a Chinese company.
Well, that's kind of what you answered my question. I just wanted to know how big of a customer we are of them. As in, like, how many Chinese products wind up in the United States. I want to know, like, because that makes a lot more sense to me moving forward, that one of the reasons that China is so trepidatious in the way that they deal with their relationship with us, because it's like, oh, well, if the United States basically turned us off and stopped buying our stuff, how big of an impact would that have on the Chinese economy, right? Like, that's kind of where my brain was going with that.
Yeah, but let's just say it's almost impossible for us to stop using made in China stuff. And because if we actually do, I think
our production capability isn't the same as theirs. So we couldn't produce for ourselves. Yeah,
exactly. So what you saw in 2020 with the whole toilet paper frenzy, with everything, the masks and stuff, is very real. And I think China knows that. That's why they're like, even if the United States is trying to decouple they're like, we're confident they can't do it completely
Right,
because it's
you
just
need
impossible.
us.
Yeah, and then even if the United States can do it, right? Go back to like World War II level of production. Other countries are going to be like begging the U.S. to stop doing that because guess what? Other countries cannot deal with China the same way that the United States can.
Right. Globalization has pros and cons. You get your cheaper products, but you also give away a little bit of your sovereignty.
Yep.
You have to. Yeah.
And it's going to take many years before India, Vietnam, Indonesia and Thailand can really replace China. That just shows you how much of the reliance we've built over the decades since reform and opening up. So it's 40, 50 years. So if at minimum it's going to take another 40, 50 years for things to go away from China, right? Completely, that is. But I just don't see it happening because, I mean, like, the day that China remains this way, it's also a concern for them, too, because China ultimately also wants to move away from manufacturing basic stuff, right? They also want to become a tech powerhouse, net exporter of service rather than exporter of goods. But it's just very hard for them because, China's economy, it was going well, and then COVID hit, and then Xi Jinping decided, let's go back to Mao. So things kind of halted halfway through. But yeah, that's also a goal China wants to have, is to stop exporting and start to import some of the basic stuff, but export the cutting edge stuff.
Well, I think it's very interesting that you've talked about the fact that China exports cheap, manufactured, produced goods because they have the population that can do that. Right? Whereas the United States exports, I mean, besides our gay ideology right now, we export, technology and innovation and, innovation, right? Like that's what we export. And I think China wants to be the net exporter of innovation. But then you also talked about how, because of the system inside of China, they don't place a premium on innovation, so they're not innovating anything because there's not the brain power there to do it because the economic system doesn't allow for it. And that kind of brings me to my final question. So if you didn't know, David, my wife's a big fan. She's followed you for years, and so she made me promise to ask you this question tonight. So this was not an elaborate ruse to work this question in. It just actually it slides right in here, right into your DMs, as it were. But so as an educator, she's looking at China's education system, and in understanding that China is experiencing a demographic crisis, the population is aging faster than they can replace it. The economic system is not there for them to innovate in order for them to replace the population. And we do know that they're 20 to 30 years from this economic collapse just due to the fact that the older generation is dying off.
Yeah.
As an educator, she wants to know, is China doing anything within their education system to try to hedge this problem off, to fix it? Like, are they trying to teach their kids something different? Are they coming up with any type of innovation? Are they changing education methods or curriculum? Or are they just whistling past the graveyard, we would say, in the United States?
So the short answer is they're not doing anything to change it. China has been stuck in this slump of how to. So the question about the coming collapse of the economy, right? There's many factors. I'll just name one. So the aging population is one of the big factors because there's so much pressure in the Chinese society that today people don't want to perform for the government. People don't want to contribute for the government because they don't see. Because really, if you think about, what JFK said is so true. It's like if you want the people to do something for the government has to be able to show that it's able to reward the people, right? Or that the people is able to speak, or people is in control, right? Not the government. But so obviously in China the dynamic is different because the government controls people. So people don't see reasons to perform for the government, to contribute for the well-being of the economy. So with that being said, people aren't interested in raising a family in China today, right? So this goes into the school system. Sure. So in China, your wife
you can't just turn on and off a one-child policy.
Right.
You can't just like switch the valve off and be like, have babies.
Or an all-boy policy. Yeah.
Right. And it's very expensive to raise a child in China because there are so many people. It's very competitive. It's more competitive than a capitalist society, which is very interesting, right? There's, right now the economy is so bad. There's competition to be delivery drivers. There's like hundreds of people, applications to be delivery drivers. So kids are graduating, and they don't see a purpose in their future because basically China is a whole testing machine, right? They teach kids how to do well on tests. They don't teach kids all of the life stuff that matters to them, except minus, the few elites who are sending them to education that's much better. But the vast majority of Chinese kids prepare for the high school exam, which is the SAT, get into university, and then hoping that at the end of it, they somehow find a job. And many people don't. So with that being said, China's not.
Well, that sounds a lot like the American traditional, Department of Education system right now too, which is very interesting.
But because there's so many different factors, right? The United States has less population than China.
Right.
The economy is doing much better relatively, right? All these things, and then so with China's current condition, they're not able to turn anything around except for keep going forward and see how it goes. So to answer your question, they can't really do anything.
Not.
It's impossible.
So according to Abraham Lincoln, he said, "Show me the classroom of today, and I will show you the government of tomorrow." Mm-hmm. If they don't turn it around, I mean, the brain drain that they're already experiencing, along with the coming demographic collapse that they know that they're going to have, it would seem to me, and this was the other question I had for you, which was just kind of low-hanging fruit. World War III update, I don't think China has what it takes. Like they can't afford to get into any type of protracted long-term warfare with anybody. Their subs are sinking overseas. Their buildings are collapsing inside of the country. They just had several. There was a flooding incident in one of the central provinces this year. They've had several terrible weather incidents that have cost them. I don't really see.
Before we shift gears too hard, I want to ask you one question.
Sorry.
No, it's okay because I want to talk about this too, 100%. But I had a question for you in regards to everything you were talking about before, innovation and technology. One of the things that it gets proposed with the H-1B visa to bring people, specifically like tech workers, to the United States is that protecting the work they do and then the intellectual property that they create while they're here in the United States. And I'm just curious, what your thoughts are on some of the legislation that's been proposed to stop people on H-1B visas, specifically those coming from China, from going back to China and using some of these skills, or they come in and they're on an education visa. And then they use that visa to get a job. What are your thoughts on the legislation to stop some of this stuff and this tech, this innovation, leaving the United States, where there is a freedom to choose whether you work with the government or not, versus going back to China where you have no option?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question, and I'll tell you my perspective, which is that a lot of Chinese people, when they're studying in the United States, their hearts aren't they're not with the United States. What does that mean? So they're still using apps to communicate with people at home. They're still consuming Chinese information, Chinese news, and things like that. They're not incorporated into the American society. They're not being, pushed into this whole Americanized melting pot, this situation, right? Mm-hmm. So they're not accepted.
They're visitors.
Visitors,
and
yes.
they see themselves as visitors, yeah.
They don't... The difference between Chinese and Indians, you see this, it's a huge difference. Indians,
nice.
Even though they're still maintaining their own culture, they're very much more integrated into the society, right? So the Chinese students, the international students, they don't feel like they belong here. They feel like they're here because they need to go and get this degree so that go back home, they have a better opportunity. They don't think that they should here. Now, some do, right? A lot of students do. they actually want to stay in the United States. So those people probably, if they're given the opportunity with H-1B to immigrate, getting a green card, obviously they will stay. But you can't discount the idea that these people learn these skills, did these innovation or researches, that they're not going to go back to China and use them to the benefit of seeking, getting a job in China, right? There's no way to stop that. So all these legislations, I don't know if they're going to be passed or not, but the point here is if they use the resources in the United States, the environment here to innovate, and then they decide to go home and to benefit an adversary, I think from the perspective of the lawmakers, that's obviously not going to fly. So I think if the legislations are if that's what they're intending, then I think it's fair, right? If you're not going to contribute to the society, I think it goes with anything. If you're not going to contribute with the society, obviously you shouldn't be benefiting from it. Because what China has been doing is precisely that. They lock down these students who have done researches in the United States. They tell them to go back to China because they'll get a better job. They'll be paid a lot as long as they share that research with the Chinese government or with Chinese universities. So it's a very real situation. It's already been happening for many years. So, that's where I'll leave it with the question.
Yeah, to that point,
I like you.
I think it's fair, right? Like I like exchange student programs. I like the idea of being able to go abroad and study in another culture, another language, another perspective, and then bring it back home. I think exchange students is fine for a semester, for a year. But the idea that, and I'm not up on this legislation, so if I say something that's like a misstep, Brandon, like check me immediately.
No, you're good, dude.
But I think the idea of like you come here, you receive an American education, to take that education and then take it back to another, country is fundamentally unfair to the country that you're studying in. And I would say the same thing to an American that went to a foreign country, to any country, and said like, oh no, I went over there and I got an education in Vietnam, and then I brought that education back here. It's like, well, if you're going to go there and stay there for 4 years to get a college education, why would you do that and then rip it out of that country? And that brain drain, I think, is just in a gut instinct level is fundamentally unfair. I think it's unfair to that culture. I think it's unfair to that country, and any country, right, that would do that and allow students to do that.
Especially STEM students, because I think too you could, because you're like flirting with the line of like individual sovereignty, right? Like you're going to stop somebody from doing what they want to do, and that's very anti-American, all these things. But the other half of it too is if you're coming here and you're in some sort of STEM field, you're learning at university, you're spending time in labs like MIT or at Harvard, all these places, and you're going back, tons of money spent on you, all these things that I do see. Sort of like the obligation that like students who go to military academies have. They have to spend time serving the U.S. military because their education was paid for. Especially like if you're here for culinary school, I don't give a shit. You know what I mean? But like if I'm just being real, right? If I go to France to learn how to cook and I come back to the United States, go back to to.
That's for you.
But the STEM fields, though, I think are the heavy consideration here because there is a lot of that data leak, that tech leak, all these things.
It's called the brain drain, and they do it. They do it.
I think there's a conversation there to be had, even though there are like some moral, I guess, thoughts. But
would you think it would be fair to say this? Like, hey, if you're going to attend a United States university for 4 years, or even more specifically, for
get a doctorate
and doctorate's degrees. Then you should be at least on a path to becoming a United States citizen. It's okay for you to be here, right?
So.
It's like, but it's like, no, if you're going
obligations.
Yes, a certain amount of obligation. Like you should be trying to get a United States citizenship in order to attend that level of education. Like for your point, Brandon, like if it's a bachelor's degree in like business, like okay,
right,
okay, bro, like
right, yeah, you're going wherever, culinary and fucking
I think that would be a fair thing to expect of college students because you look at I think the Saudi crown prince right now I know he's Ivy League educated. If you look that one up, I know if you look in Qatar and a lot of the other Middle Eastern nations, they send.
Why aren't they going to Chinese colleges to get their
That's a very
education.
good. That's a very good point. It's a
Yeah.
very good point. But then they send them here, they get them Western educations, and then they go straight back home. You know,
Yeah.
and you know that's a lot of money. There's a lot of money in endowments. I think Harvard's endowment fund alone could buy most of the countries in Africa if they wanted to.
Wow.
Yeah, no, it's huge. Actually, I'll have to look that up in the background what their endowment fund is, but Harvard's endowment fund is huge.
Yeah.
It is
I am willing
massive.
to shift back to the World War III question, Chris, because that is a topic. You know, like
Yeah.
the doom. I've asked you this every time you come on. You know, like the doomsday clock
Yeah,
of World War
where we
III,
at?
the Thucydides trap. You know, all these questions you can throw at it, but like. It does seem more and more as time goes on, this existential threat of China, it seems more and more like a boogeyman than it does an actual. I mean, obviously it's a threat; it should be treated as such. But there does seem to be more smoke and mirrors than there used to be as time goes on. Would you agree with that, or do you think that the Chinese are still the CCP, I should say, that the CCP is still very willing to go to a hot war with the United States?
I think Xi Jinping is definitely trying to go for Taiwan. Whether he succeeds or not, again, that's another question. But from the looks of it, like China recently just tested their ICBM. So like they want to still tell the world that after, purging all these generals, their rocket force can still launch a missile.
Yeah.
But to answer your first part of the question is, are we closer to World War III? I think it all depends on what we can do to stop China. So deterrence is a big one, right? The United States is on path to do that. The second one, I think, is if we can somehow maximize, and again, this attributes a lot to like how each president handles the situation. Because clearly, like, I think with Trump, like, the global situation was not as tense as it was now.
Definitely not.
So for me, the question is, are we closer to World War III? Theoretically, yes, but in practicality, I think no, because China's military is it's not as functional as we think, right? I'm a firm believer of that. Now, with that being said, I always look at how Putin, he clearly knows that if he did invade Ukraine, there would be a lot of support from Europe, from the U.S. Like maybe he doesn't have as much of military power compared to all these other nations would supply, arms to Ukraine. But he still did it. Because I think the issue fundamentally with Xi Jinping and Putin is that they, more than anything, care about their own personal legacy and achievement than the lives of Russians or Chinese people. So even if like Xi knows that he's going to sacrifice a few million to get an island, he will do it if he thinks that the calculated risk is worth taking.
And if I'm Xi, I'm also looking at the fact that the United States has sent billions of dollars to Ukraine, sent millions and millions of dollars,
Signed away more today.
Israel, and I'm also looking at that because it's not 1945 anymore. The United States is not backing up what they're doing with production that can fund two world wars, on two fronts. So I'm also thinking this might be my time, and then also knowing what we know about the island. Political climates, also knowing what we know about, is the United States regime going to change hands again to one that is very opposed to the Chinese threat versus one that would be, again, the vice president being very friendly to China, one that would be very friendly to China. I think they're also looking at that with the timeline of there's only certain times that you can get onto the island, and I'm not giving up any information that you can't find just by looking at on Google about what the weather is there, but also looking at the weather patterns around the island. You're also looking at between October and January is when the tides go out, and that's the time that it's friendly to boats going in and out. So I'm very interested in the next 4 months as far as naval power is concerned, because that's if I'm Xi, that's what I'm looking at as my timeline. right? What is going to happen in the United States government versus what's friendly to me geologically, or sorry,
geopolitically.
Well, geopolitically, and then by the weather, I'm looking at
Oh
that.
yeah, okay.
And then I'm also looking at the fact that I don't have much time left, because if we let this go another 8 years,
he's old.
He's old. The Chinese demographic is aging out of the ability, the brain drain. Everything we've talked about tonight is coming to a crossroads, and so it's like I see China, and this is just, again, no behind the curtains. This is just everything you can find on the internet. I see China as a cornered animal that is looking at its own existence. And like that's what they're looking at least the political regime in China is what I'm looking at. And then I'm going, if I'm to preserve my existence, and then also coming out of 100 years of shame, like you talked about, coming to the point where it's like I'm trying to convince the world that I should be the leader, and then looking at me going into a demographic political decline, which we can't, if they're to be honest with themselves behind closed doors, they can't negate it's going to happen, then now is either the time to do it or to reduce back into obscurity to where they don't want to be. And I think that's a very interesting time that we're finding ourselves in.
Yeah, like your point, I totally agree with. I think nobody knows how the war is going to go, right? But whether it starts or not, it's really not up to us. It's all up to Xi Jinping, because he's the only one who's trying to get this done, right? Like the United States is not trying to, send missiles to China to blow up Beijing or Shanghai or anything like that.
Right.
So at the end of the day, like what we can say is that the factors for war, or I guess you would say the elements that could ignite a war is there. It's whether or not Xi Jinping really does decide to do it, because once it starts, it will be the Chinese Communist Party knows that once the war starts, it will either end in a very bloody way, in which that there's a lot of casualty, or it could be a very regional thing, very small thing. But I really highly doubt that that's going to be the case. It's going to be a very massive, full. Well, and
we know for a fact that they do not have the economic capital to have an extended war with the United States.
So it has to be quick and fast.
It would have to be, and that's the other thing that they have got to be thinking about. They want to strike quickly and decisively, and end it. And that's another reason
American
why
subs have entered the chat.
And that's the other reason that I'm worried about October to January, because the idea, again, if I'm looking at this as a political leader, I'm going, and again, as a Chinese political leader, I'm going, okay, there's a possibility Trump takes back over. Trump does not like us. If I do something now, and under a soft on China, Biden, Harris administration. Yeah, Harry Ball's administration. If I do something now, right, then the conflict will be a thing when Trump takes office, which he will have to deal with, but it's already happening, which will make the American people more sympathetic to it, because Americans don't want another war. I can tell you right now, from every American, like Ukraine, Israel, it's wearing us down. Americans don't want another war, right? So there's that. So it'll put pressure on a Trump administration to tamp it down quickly, just give them what they want, and we don't start another war. So I have that. Or if the Harry Balls administration does take over, they're already soft on us to begin with, and so it kind of rolls on, and we get what we want. So this is kind of the point in the poker game where you either go all in and I get everything I want, right? Or I fold and I go, the risk wasn't worth the cost, and we hold out. And so I think the next 4 months, just as the way I'm looking at things, is kind of the.
I feel like it is now or never for China,
I don't know,
man.
What do you guys think?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think they're looking to do something basically when the rest of the world is distracted with the Middle East and Russia, right? So why not do something amidst all this? I personally think that if they do really try to go for Taiwan, it could be the end of the regime, because Xi Jinping will try. Like if he does go for it, he will want to finish it, right? He'll want to take it because he's not gonna, just do it halfway and say let's retreat. Because I know he knows that either he starts
it's all or nothing.
It's all or nothing, right? So I don't know is there a way to deter him from doing it, whether that's economic pressure or something like that. Obviously, we have not been doing it enough, and she knows it. So
I think there just needs.
Point, I mean,
sorry, go ahead, David.
No, I'm just saying. At this point, I think we can only hope that the domestic situation in China is bad enough that he can't even start it. But who knows? I mean, like when things are really bad, a war isn't necessarily a bad thing to do because, I mean, you could start ramping up production and that could boost the economy and things like that. So, I mean, that's what happened with Nazi Germany, right? So it's not necessarily a thing that can stop a war. But I just hope that there has to be some factors in China that can deter him because otherwise I don't see how the U.S. can stop this. They can respond, but I don't see how they can stop it.
I think you make some great points because, like, you mentioned Germany, right? The Weimar Republic was collapsing. Hitler, in the Democratic Socialist Workers Party, they made all of these inroads and the conversations that Hitler was having about, Germany and how much, they had to pay the reparations of World War I. And there's all this like German nationalism that went into it and the collapsing economy and, building up the German military became sort of that impetus for bringing it back together. And like, I almost think is like, this is a will thing you have to break because the decision I think is made, right? When you talk about it like this, the decision is made that Taiwan must come back into China, and it is China and all of these things. So it's a question of, I mean, could you, protract, further economic warfare? You should, because you got to look, I think you have to look at it as that unconventional warfare. Now, everything is on the table as far as it goes. The United States has to behave that way because the Chinese have way before we are. And I think that there's other things you can do. Obviously, militarily, deterrence-wise, the posture we take against China, I do think that Donald Trump becoming president will be a better deterrence than a Kamala Harris and Tim Walz presidency. But I think it's a wills thing, and that I think that will sort of ties into more of the deterrence factor of it, because really only thing you have to do, or what you have to do, is break his determination to do it by saying, I know this is all or nothing for me. And if I do this, there will be nothing because of the strength that I'm seeing. And it's all about that exhibition of strength and power. And I think that's really it, because there's not a lot of other avenues really you're going to change somebody's mind who's so invested the way Xi Jinping is, like Putin is, to rebuild the old USSR, so.
Yeah, so I think that ultimately, like, with allies like Japan, the Philippines, and others, like the only thing you can really do is to try to maximize, the damage that he was sustained, so that he can think that it's too much, right? Because I think that's the whole argument from Rich Colby, which in his book he talks about this idea to basically, deny the possibility because the risk is just outweighs the reward.
Exactly.
But could it be something that, where he's just so set on doing it, he's like, I'm going to die anyways, or I'm going to, it's over for me anyways, I just do it, right? With that kind of like corner dog mentality. So there's a lot of possibility there. From, if you're a rational, perspective examining the situation, you might think that there's issues with the Chinese military. Obviously, they don't want to seem weak in that sense. But I think it's good for the United States and others to be like, hey, we should still prepare. Let's just not let our guard down on this, because he's still trying to do it. Prepare both ways and hope for the best. And Taiwan, I think also Taiwan needs to step up. To be frank, not everybody on Taiwan, the issue of Taiwan being invaded is very solid or on the same sort of understanding. A lot of people actually in Taiwan think that there's nothing they can do. Right? So there is a population in Taiwan which at the end of the day, if you really think about it, like they have to have the will to defend themselves too. It's not just the United States and Japan that needs to do the heavy work too. So Taiwan, the Taiwanese people also need to realize that this is a life or death situation. So there's a lot of room to grow there as well.
How much of that Taiwanese population would be okay with reassimilating?
It's mostly the older generation, which obviously they're also dwindling down to, the numbers are less and less per election. This year you see obviously it's unprecedented because the party that won, with Tsai Ing-wen, which is 8 years, and now 4 more years with William Lai, which is the same party. So that tells us that it's less and less, but it doesn't mean everybody is feeling the same way, which is something that needs to improve. So, but yeah, I think at the end of the day, it has to reach Xi Jinping for him to stop. Otherwise, prepare for the worst. From my end, I think we should still be prepared for potential there. But there's other uncertainties too. China's economy could collapse to the point where they have no way to go forward. Because right now they just released a massive stimulus to try to revive the economy. The stock market did go up in a few points, but it's a very temporary thing. So there's a lot of hidden issues. Yeah, no, in mainland China.
Oh, mainland.
Yeah, so so there's a lot of hidden issues. So let's see. Maybe the wind will be on our side this time, and we won't see a repeat of what happened in Ukraine. But yeah, I wouldn't say that it's 100% thing though, because at the end of the day, Xi Jinping has a much bigger army, bigger military, more power.
You can have a bigger army, but based on corruption we've seen, on corruption we've seen in the Chinese military, and what could be large scale mechanical failure, which you've presented tonight with the sub sinking and then rockets being filled with water. It's like, how much of that is China presenting themselves as superior, or is it a giant paper tiger? And I think that's going to be, and then what's the resolve of the political leaders to see it through too? You know, so it's like we've got a lot of things going into this, and I personally like to present this fact that this might be the one time everybody's like, oh, World War III, because it generates clicks and people are, there's a lot of consternation around it, but it could be the one time in modern political history that we're saved by sheer fucking incompetence. All the way around. It could just be that, where it's all the way around. It's just incompetence, where it's like, it's just a bunch of saber rattling and moronic retards just saying stuff like that they can't back up. It could be that. Well, it really could. There is a world where that exists. Yeah, no, totally. I mean, there is systemic corruption within the Chinese military. Is there even any fighting will left of the people? Clearly, they're trying to mobilize the propaganda to make people feel the energy. But I mean, because there's a lot of generals within the military. The reason why Xi Jinping did the purge in the first place is because a lot of these generals don't agree with the invasion, because they don't want to die for something. Like, you don't want to die for a madman's plan, because you're the one who has to shed. You won't see your family at the end of the day, right? So for these generals, they really don't agree with his plan. But,
will there be anything left when the war is over? The United States is going to bomb the shit out of the TSMC factory. Like, anything worth having won't be there anymore in the first place.
Yeah, but I think for Xi, he's more about the fact that it needs to reunify than practical. TSMC. No. But we'll see how it goes. I think, hopefully the next time we do this again, it will be not like, having to talk about how many parts of Taiwan is still remaining intact. Hopefully that day won't come. But I think it's still ultimately down to keeping Xi Jinping's problems massive and keeping the Taiwan Strait safe that way. Otherwise, he's dead set on doing it.
Well, there's a big part of the conflict that, and again, this is all open source information, but there's a big part of the conflict that comes down to the fact that China desires Taiwan not just because it's an island, right? Like, there's the idea of like, what does giant mainland China want with this tiny little island that's smaller than Rhode Island? It's because Taiwan has manufacturing capabilities and intellectual capabilities in producing microchips that is supplying a bunch of the world. And so one of the problems with the conflict on both sides with this tiny island in between is that you can't just bomb the shit out of the island, because then all the manufacturing capabilities and all the intellectual capabilities in the form of human beings' brains are dead and blown up. And so you can't just do that. So any conflict that's going to take place over that small little speck of dirt, it's not like Iwo Jima in World War II where it's just, volcanic sand and ash. It's no, the island has to be standing, and the people have to be willing to go into or be a part of whatever government takes over at the end. And so you can't just pull that off through force of arms. And that's another giant part of that conflict that a lot of people don't really understand, right? Because if it was just about taking a speck of dirt, sure, we could drop 10, Moabs on the island and it would be done, right? Like, there you go. There's your speck of dirt. Have it, right? Like, that's not the point. And China could too. They absolutely could too. But then everything that they came there for would be gone. And then what's the point?
And that's why I think the preferred method for the CCP is through so-called peaceful reunification, right?
Right.
Co-opt the island, use these influencers political warfare to co-opt the island into surrendering without firing a shot. Right. They want to do that preferably too, because they know the cost of war as well. It's but at the end of the day, if they can do it without firing a shot, why not do that? That's why I mentioned on the island there's a huge population of people that still agree with the idea of unification, because they think that they can't afford to die in a war, right? They don't want to be bombarded. So that's another concern as well.
No, 100%. And then the other thing that they're looking at too is the United States is coming off of, we were 20 years off of the global war on terror, and now we're right back into it and what we're doing in Europe and in Israel. So it's like, China hasn't been involved in a major world conflict since World War II. Well, since the Korean War, excuse me. They haven't been involved in a major world conflict since then. So even though they have this giant military that they're saber-rattling with to the entire world, it is a completely unproven military that is completely based on optics of them marching down Tiananmen Square and doing military parades. So it's like, you can do that all day long and teach soldiers how to march together in goose step, but they haven't been proven. They've never been in conflict with anybody except for small little skirmishes on the Indian border and other places. So it's like, you also have that going on, and they know that too. They absolutely know that it is all pomp and circumstance.
Yeah,
it's.
Did you guys see the video of I don't know if it was ISIS or Taliban special forces doing the training on a giant
tire walks? Yes.
Oh my God! It's like the same thing in China. They do all these really. So the soldiers, they learn to fold their blankets like really tight bricks into like a very, very, very uniform, very tight bricks. But I'm like, that has nothing to do with fighting a war. Like, I feel like a lot of times
basic training stuff.
I was reliably
it's basic training stuff. No, because they do that. We do that American basic training too. It's about like attention to detail. But you're right. The whole point of something like that is how well can you do the little things, and then your attention to detail needs to be on point. You know what I mean? But you're right. Like the tire stuff. These goofy little videos that the Taliban will put out in these goober ass little obstacle courses they make out in the middle of the desert. You're not scaring anybody, dude. I did that at sleepaway camp when I was in 8th grade. Like, cool, dude. But it's just funny. I mean, you said a couple of times that the PLA has a lot of issues. Other than corruption, what are some of those issues that you're talking about?
So corruption is a very big one. So there's also an issue of brotherhood, especially within the chain of commands for developing talent. So within the rocket force, for example, not anymore, but they used to only promote their own people within the rocket force. Like, they wouldn't just transfer another general from like the army or the air force to be their commanding officer. They wouldn't do that. But now, obviously, Xi Jinping is like, no, we gotta, because his whole thing is all about you can't have loyalty to other people, right? You have to have loyalty to the party. So they don't like these kind of cult of personalities, even though he's trying to promote one himself. But so he did the reshuffling on that. There's also cross-department sort of. I don't even know what to describe it as. Basically, you have like, you know how there's conflicts between like, you know, if you join the army, you don't like the Marines, or you know, you think the Air Force people are all like rich, snobby people who get all the funding.
I don't
like
know
that
what
kind
you're
of thing,
talking
right?
about.
We are, yeah.
but there's jealousy involved within the party. So there's a lot of like infighting as well. There's also different factions. So you have people who are sort of like the elites of the party, right? So these people are like what they're called the second generation or the third generation of the Red families. So these are well-known members of the Communist Party who, you know, they were elders in the past, and then or they were military generals. And you have a group called the Princelings, which are seen as sort of like the royalty of the party, right? So you have a lot of different factions, different sort of allegiance to different families, factions, etc. So that creates a lot of conflicts as well. And then there's also the agreement on, because I think even if there's corruption within the military, there's still a certain level of, I guess you would say, loyalty to the idea of a soldier, which, you know, to anybody who has not been, who didn't serve, right, you probably wouldn't understand that, because the civilian mentality and the in-service mentality is different. So for these people, when Xi Jinping came in to kind of try to control them, because you know, he didn't really have a lot of respect within the military to begin with. He didn't really grow up within the military. So when an outsider is trying to tell you what to do, you naturally reject it, right? So that's why there's also like his former defense minister, Li Shangfu, who has since been like removed, apparently was secretly saying things like how he's a fat pig and all these things, like basically just really undermined his legitimacy as a military leader, because I mean he didn't have any credibility to start with. So just these like very minute details that kind of add together, which I also find is interesting. You also mentioned that they haven't had experience fighting a real war since the Korean War. So all of these things are negatives about it. The only positive thing that the military has done really well, especially the army, is fighting floods and natural disasters. Because for many years, every time there's an earthquake, right, they send the military guys there. They send the army guys, the young guys who, you know, like the 2008 earthquake in Wenchuan, like these guys were going in with their bare hands and they're like digging through, you know, concrete or what's left of the concrete to find survivors. Like they were all doing that with their bare hands, and they weren't given any equipment. Like, so the army is very experienced in dealing with natural disasters, not so much with the war. So the lack of experience. So just trying to think if there's any other things. There's also, okay, so yeah, a big key here is how the commander system works. So what they will do is, for example, right, because China has a few, they're called theater commands. So you have the Northern Theater Commands, the Southeast Theater Commands. What they would do is they shuffle the commanding officers around, because they think that the longer they stay in that particular theater, they're going to start developing influence. So they don't want that. So they start shuffling them around to redistribute sort of power and things like that. So there's never this like preparation or a chain of commands where it's like built through experience, people training together, how things work. They're always doing that because they fear that they can develop these local forces that eventually could threaten, you know, the central government, and so they don't want any of those things to develop. So there's just a lot of these like, yeah, exactly. It's like, imagine if the Pentagon just sits there all day and trying to decide if people in Texas are going to revolt against DC. It's kind of like that mentality, which you never know, you know, because
Texans,
it's a fear,
you know. Yeah.
It's all very interesting to me.
There's a Texan embassy in the UK.
If the idea is loyalty to party first, and then those are the officers that are getting promoted, and there is no meritocracy to be spoken of, so there's no ability for advancement other than loyalty to the party, then I would also imagine that there's a problem of officers that are highly promoted because of their loyalty to the party that then don't have any of the other basic abilities to lead or understand war strategy or understand how to fight, understand their basic job, or understand the capabilities and capacities of the units that they lead, because they were promoted only because they were loyal to the party, not because they're a good general.
No, that's exactly it. Because Xi Jinping doesn't care if you can fight a war or not. You just have to listen to his orders, because he's going to tell you how to fight a war, right? Because
he knows.
It's like the commander in chief is actually overseeing the war, which usually isn't how it is. He's in the situation room. He's going to be like, tell me the latest update. But Xi Jinping wants to personally direct the war. He wants to, because by the way, he's not commander in chief in the sense that he can control the military. He's the chairman of the Central Military Commission, which means that he gives direct orders to tell people how to, you're going to fire the missile here. You're going to send the troops here. So he has a lot more
big
commands.
Single point of failure.
Yeah, and how could he even do that and yet still run a country on the other side if you have all of that decision making?
Well, he's the divine leader, so it's all just going to come in,
I think they need to start dressing him in yellow then. David, you get that joke.
Right, yeah, no, yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely.
I'm just saying.
I really just have one last question for you, man. I'm curious if there's any what the Chinese state media says about the Trump-Vance campaign versus the Harris-Walz campaign, and if there's an obvious favorite, right? I feel like there is, but what is that?
So, very interesting. I was actually thinking about this. I was like, who does the CCP want in office again? And from the current looks of it, it doesn't really matter to them, because they've had experience with both now, and they haven't had a lot of fun experience so far.
So interesting.
Because, even if the Biden administration, we say that objectively they're less aggressive on the China side,
right.
The CCP just had so many problems to deal with it. I don't think at this point it matters, because since the end of their whole zero COVID lockdown thing, they've just been busy with trying to solve their issues that they haven't, like even the meetings that she had with Biden, in San Francisco and at the G20 meeting, it's very unproductive. They just shake hands. They talk about the U.S. is talking about the U.S. stuff. China's talking about Chinese stuff. Whatever they're talking about, they're like talking past each other. They're not really getting anything productive done. So in that sense, it really doesn't matter for China right now, because their domestic situation is just terrible, and it doesn't help the fact that I think even if Trump goes back to office, I really don't see the communications being the same as it was before. Like where they will send a whole delegation to the White House to talk about the phase one trade deal, right? Yeah. I just think like fundamentally there seems to be, it's like two people that broke up. It will never be the same anymore. Right. And I think 2020 was really like, the pandemic was really the point where they broke up. It won't be the same again. So to answer your question, not sure yet. I'm guessing they hope that Trump wouldn't go back into office, because they don't want to deal with that sort of situation where they have to do a whole trade war. They're not in a position to do another trade war, clearly. China. So.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I'm curious if they do have any sort of spin on the American election. Media-wise, I'm sure they do, and I'd be curious to hear from you about that. But I totally figured that they wouldn't want Trump back in office just because of the sort of strong arm that they would have to deal with, more than I feel like the inexperience would be the kind way, and incompetence I feel like would be the more accurate way to describe a Harris-Walz presidency. But I'd be interested to hear the media spin.
He just brought something up that I had not considered before, and that is being that Trump is the more competent businessman than either like anybody in the current administration. It also, again, if I'm hedging my bet, there's a lot of business communication to be had that Trump would be very amenable to and would understand, because it's like I can speak with him on business terms. Whereas maybe I can politically strong arm the current administration, but economically I can work better with a Trump administration if I'm willing to play ball. And that is a very interesting. That's very interesting you brought that up, David. I can see that now. Because they have to have plans for both, right? Like if you're a competent strategist.
Well, if Trump is what he says he's going to do, which is protect American, industries from China, then it's not going to be good for China, because technically the idea of China rising is built on exploiting American industries, right? So in that sense,
but through the Belt and Road Initiative, I'm saying I think that I have enough infrastructure in place that it's like I can still force America to the table to bid with me.
Exactly. So that's that's what the Phase 1 trade deal was really about. It was exchanging reliance, But Trump, I think the point here is that Trump actually says what he will do, and a lot of times that's kind of scary for these people, because I think the point we're all really lost on, at least even a lot of China experts, is how Trump loves to praise Xi Jinping and loves to say I'm friends with Kim or Putin or whatever, right? A lot of people are lost on that idea, saying that okay, look, Trump is definitely going to sell us out because he says Xi Jinping is whatever. Let's go past the rhetoric and really focus on Trump in what the substance is when it comes to China. You'll find that he really kickstarted a conversation on China that never happened before, right? So his administration fundamentally changed how the problems with China would be solved, and that's basically telling them, no, you can't exploit Americans anymore in this sense. So if we go back to that, I don't think China's very comfortable with that. Because so here's my conspiracy, okay? Ooh. Part of the reason why China allowed the virus to kind of spread and to halt the United States is because the Phase 1 trade deal had just been signed a year prior, and they really cannot fulfill the obligations on it. But one thing that could stop all these economic activities is if the world ground to a halt and we didn't have any production left. So that's my conspiracy. I'm like, Xi Jinping was like, wow, perfect, we got a pandemic. Let's use this to wage a war on the world and to not have to deal with Trump stuff. Because, I've spoken to former Trump officials about the situation. They don't want to talk about it because obviously, the Phase 1 trade deal really didn't go anywhere. But I was just like, what would happen if it actually had gone through, right? Now, the impact would have been great, but we never saw it because, obviously the pandemic came. So that's my little conspiracy. And
it's an interesting thought.
So we'll see. Let's see if there will be another one of these global pandemics somehow that just magically appears if Trump goes back into office. Who knows? My point is I think Xi Jinping doesn't want to see, because also with Trump, you have a better economy too, right? And so that part is what China doesn't want to have. Because if back in the days before 2019, China's economy was doing really well. Mm-hmm. That's what gave Xi Jinping the confidence to do that trade war. Mm-hmm. But today is different. So he has less chips to play with today than he did 4 years ago.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. David, genuinely appreciate you coming on and talking to us again, man. It's always a good conversation. I always walk away feeling like I've broadened my knowledge base a lot more. It's good to get your perspective. Why don't you go ahead and then let everybody know where they can find you again, and let's talk. Rep the merch a little bit there, and yeah, man, appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks. You can find me on YouTube. You can find me on Instagram, Twitter, etc. Just search China Insider or David Zhang. And you'll be able to find me.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much for your time tonight, brother. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for having me.